Metamorphosis by Franz Kafka, as translated by David Wiley. One morning, when Gregor Samsa woke from troubled dreams, he found himself transformed in his bed into a horrible vermin. He lay on his armor-like back, and if he lifted his head a little, he could see his brown belly, slightly domed and divided by arches into stiff sections. The bedding was hardly able to cover it, and seemed ready to slide off any moment. His many legs, pitifully thin compared with the size of the rest of him, waved about helplessly as he looked. "What's happened to me?" he thought. It wasn't a dream. His room, a proper human room, although a little too small, lay peacefully between its four familiar walls. A collection of textile samples lay spread out on the table. Samsa was a traveling salesman. And above it there hung a picture that had recently cut out of an illustrated magazine and housed in a nice gilded frame. It showed a lady fitted out with a fur hat and fur boa who sat upright, raising a heavy fur muff that covered the whole of her lower arm toward the viewer. Gregor then turned to look out the window at the dull weather. Drops of rain could be heard hitting the pane, which made him feel quite sad. "How about if I sleep a little bit longer and forget all this nonsense?" he thought. But that was something that he was unable to do because he was used to sleeping on his right, and in his present state he couldn't get into that position. However hard he threw himself onto his right, he always rolled back to where he was. He must have tried it 100 times. Shut his eyes so that he wouldn't have to look at the floundering legs, and only stopped when he began to feel a mild, dull pain that he had never felt before. "Oh, God," he thought, "what a strenuous career it is I've chosen. Traveling day in and out, doing business like this takes much more effort than doing your own business at home. And on top of that, there's the curse of traveling. Worries about making train connections, bad and irregular food, contact with different people all of the time so that you can never get to know anyone or become friendly with them. It all can go to hell." He felt a slight itch up on his belly, pushed himself slowly up on his back toward the headboard so that he could lift his head better, found where the itch was, and saw that it was covered with lots of little white spots which he didn't know what to make of. And when he tried to feel the place with one of his legs, he drew it quickly back. As soon as he touched it, he was overcome by a cold shudder. He slid back into his former position. "Getting up early all the time," he thought, "it makes you stupid. You've got to get enough sleep. Other traveling salesmen live a life of luxury. For instance, whenever I go back to the guest house during the morning to copy out the contract, these gentlemen are always sitting there eating their breakfast. I ought to just try that with my boss. I'd get kicked out on the spot. But who knows? Maybe that would be the best thing for me. If I didn't have my parents to think about, I'd have given my notice a long time ago. I'd have gone up to the boss and told him just what I think. Tell him everything I would. Let him know just what I feel. He'd fall right off his desk. And it's a funny sort of business to be sitting up there at your desk, talking down at your subordinates from up there, especially when you have to go right up close because the boss is hard of hearing. Well, there's still some hope. Once I've got the money together to pay off my parents' debt to him, another 5 or 6 years, I suppose. That's definitely what I'll do. That's when I'll make the big change. First of all, though, I've got to get up. My train leaves at 5.
Part 2.
First thing he wanted to do was to get up in peace without being disturbed, to get dressed, and to most of all have his breakfast. Only then would he consider what to do next, as he was well aware that he would not bring his thoughts into any sensible conclusions by lying in bed. He remembered that he had often felt a slight pain in bed, perhaps caused by lying awkwardly, but that had always turned out to be pure imagination, and he wondered how his imaginings would slowly resolve themselves today. He did not have the slightest doubt that the change in his voice was nothing more than the first sign of a serious cold, which was an occupational hazard for a traveling salesman. It was a simple matter to throw off the covers. He had only to blow himself a little early and they fell off by themselves. But it became difficult after that, especially as he was so exceptionally broad. He would have used his arms and his hands to push himself up, but instead of them, he only had those little legs continuously moving in different directions, and which he was moreover unable to control. If he wanted to bend one of them, then that was the first one that he would stretch itself out. And if he finally managed to do what he wanted with that leg, all the others seemed to be set free and would move about painfully. "This is something that can't be done in bed," Gregor said to himself, "so don't keep trying to do it." The first thing he wanted to do was get the lower part of his body out of the bed, but he had never seen his lower part and could not imagine what it looked like. It turned out to be too hard to move. It went so slowly, and finally, almost in a frenzy, when he was carelessly shoved himself forward with all the force he could gather, he chose the wrong direction and hit hard against the lower bedpost and learned from the burning pain that he felt the lower part of his body might be, well, at present, the most sensitive. So then he tried to get to the top part of his body out of the bed first, carefully turning his head to the side. This he managed quite easily, and despite his breadth and its weight, the bulk of his body eventually followed slowly in the direction of his head. But when he had at last got his head out of the bed and into the fresh air, it occurred to him that if he let himself fall, it would be a miracle if his head were not injured. So he became afraid to carry on pushing himself forward in the same way. And he could not knock himself out now at any price. Better to stay in bed than to lose consciousness. It took just as much effort to get back to where he had been earlier, but when he lay there sighing and was once more watching his legs as they struggled against each other even harder than before, if that was possible, he could think of no way of bringing peace and order to this chaos. He told himself once more that it was not possible for him to stay in bed, and that the most sensible thing to do would be to get free of it in whatever way he could, at whatever sacrifice. At the same time, though, he did not forget to remind himself that calm consideration was much better than rushing to desperate conclusions. At times like this, he would direct his eyes to the window and look out as clearly as he could. But unfortunately, even the other side of the narrow street was enveloped in morning fog, and the view had little confidence or cheer to offer him. 7 o'clock already, he said to himself when the clock struck again. 7 o'clock, and there's still a fog like this. And he lay there quietly a while longer, breathing lightly, as if perhaps he expected the total stillness to bring things back to their real and natural state. But then, he said to himself, before it strikes 7:15, I'll definitely have to have gotten properly out of bed, and by then somebody will have come around and from work and to ask what's happened to me, as they open up at work before 7 o'clock. And so he set himself to the task of swinging the entire length of his body out of the bed, all at the same time. If he succeeded in falling out of bed in this way and kept his head raised as he did so, he could probably avoid injuring it. His back seemed to be quite hard, and probably nothing would happen to falling onto the carpet. His main concern was for the loud noise he was bound to make, and which even through all the doors would probably raise concern, if not alarm. But it was something that had to be risked. Part 3. The chief clerk now raised his voice. "Mr. Samsa," he called to him, "what is wrong? You barricade yourself in your room. Give us no more than a yes or a no for an answer. You are causing serious and unnecessary concern to your parents, and you fail. And I mention this just by the way. You fail to carry out your business duties in a way that is quite unheard of. I am speaking here on behalf of your parents and of your employer, and I really must request a clear and immediate explanation. I am astonished, quite astonished. I thought I knew you as a calm and sensible person, and now you suddenly seem to be showing off with peculiar whims. This morning, your employer did suggest a possible reason for your failure to appear. It's true. It had to do with the money that was recently entrusted to you, but I came near to giving him my word of honor that could not be the right explanation. But now that I see your incomprehensible stubbornness, I no longer feel any wish whatsoever to intercede on your behalf. And nor is your position all that secure. I had originally intended to say all of this to you in private, but since you caused me to waste my time here for no good reason, I don't see why your parents should not learn of it also. Your turnover has been very unsatisfactory of late. I grant you that this is not the time of year to do especially good business. We recognize that. But there is simply no time of year to do no business at all, Mr. Samsa. We cannot allow there to be. But sir, called Gregor, beside himself and forgetting all else in excitement, I'll open up immediately. Just a moment. I'm slightly unwell. An attack of the dizzies. I haven't been able to get up. I'm still in bed now. I'm quite fresh again now, though. I'm just getting out of bed. Just a moment. Be patient. It's not quite as easy as I thought. I'm quite all right now, though. It's shocking. What can suddenly happen to a person? I'm quite all right last night. My parents know about it, perhaps better than me. I had a small symptom of it last night already. They must have noticed it. I don't know why I didn't let you know at work, but you always think you can get over an illness without staying at home. Please, don't make my parents suffer. This is no basis for any of the accusations you're making. Nobody's ever said a word to me about any of these things. Maybe you haven't read the latest contracts I sent in. I'll set off at the 8 o'clock train. As well, these few hours of rest have given me strength. You don't need to wait, sir. I'll be in the office soon after you, and please be so good to tell the boss and to recommend me to him. And while Gregor gushed out all these words, hardly knowing what he was saying, he made his way over to the chest of drawers. This was easily done, probably because of the practice he already had in bed, where he now tried to get himself upright. He really did want to open the door, really did want to let them see him and to speak with the chief clerk. The others were being so insistent, and he was curious to learn what they would say when they caught sight of him. If they were shocked, it would no longer be Gregor's responsibility, and he could rest. If, however, they took everything calmly, he would still have no reason to be upset, and if he hurried, he really could be at the station for 8 o'clock. The first few times he tried to climb up on the smooth chest of drawers, he just slid down again. But he finally gave himself one last swing and stood there upright. The lower part of his body was in serious pain, but he no longer gave any attention to it. Now he let himself fall against the back of a nearby chair and held tightly to the edges of it with his little legs. By now he had also calmed down and kept quiet so that he could listen to what the chief clerk was saying. "Did you understand a word of all of that?" the chief clerk asked his parents. "Surely he's not trying to make a fool of us." "Oh, God," called his mother, who was already in tears. "He could be seriously ill, and we're making him suffer. Greta, she then cried. "Mother," his sister called from the other side. They communicated across Gregor's room. "You'll have to go for the doctor straight away. Gregor is ill. Quick, get the doctor. Did you hear the way Gregor spoke just now?" "That was the voice of an animal," said the chief clerk, with a calmness that was in contrast to his mother's screams. Anna, his father called into the kitchen through the entrance hall, clapping his hands. "Get a locksmith here now." And the two girls, their skirts swishing, immediately ran out through the hall, wrenching open the front door of the flat as they went. How had his sister managed to get dressed so quickly? There was no sound of the door banging shut again. They must have left it open. People often do in homes where something awful has happened. Part 4. Even before the first day had come to an end, his father had explained to Gregor's mother and sister what their finances and prospects were. Now and then he stood up from the table and took some receipt or document from a little cash box he had saved from his business when it had collapsed 5 years earlier. Gregor heard how he opened the complicated lock and then closed it again after he had taken the item he wanted. What he heard his father say was some of the first good news that Gregor heard since he had first been incarcerated in his room. He had thought that nothing at all remained from his father's business. At least he had never told him of anything different, and Gregor had never asked him about it anyway. Their business misfortune had reduced the family to a state of total despair, and Gregor's only concern at that time had been to arrange things so that they could all forget about it as quickly as possible. So then he started working, especially hard, with a fiery vigor that raised him from junior salesman to a traveling representative almost overnight, bringing with it the chance to earn money in quite different ways. Gregor converted his success at work straight into cash that he could lay on the table at home for the benefit of his astonished and delighted family. They had been good times, and they had never come again, at least not with the same splendor, even though Gregor had later earned so much that he was in a position to bear the costs of the whole family, and did bear them. They had even gotten used to it, both Gregor and the family. They took the money with gratitude, and he was glad to provide it, although there was no longer much warm affection given in return. Gregor only remained close to his sister now. Unlike him, she was very fond of music and gifted and expressive violinist. It was his secret plan to send her to the conservatory next year, even though it would cause a great expense that would have to be made up for in some other way. During Gregor's short periods in town, conversation with his sister would often turn to the conservatory, but it was only ever mentioned as a lovely dream that could never be realized. Their parents did not like to hear this innocent talk, but Gregor thought about it quite hard and decided he would let them know what he planned with a grand announcement of it on Christmas Day. That was the sort of totally pointless thing that went through his mind. In his present state, pressed upright against the door and listening, there were times when he simply became too tired to continue listening. When his head would fall wearily against the door and he would pull it up again with a start, as even the slightest noise he caused would be heard next door and they would all go silent. "What's he doing now?" his father would say after a while, clearly having gone over to the door, and only then the interrupted conversation would slowly be taken up again. When explaining things, his father repeated himself several times, partly because it was a long time since he had been occupied with these matters himself, and partly because Gregor's mother did not understand everything the first time. From these repeated explanations, Gregor learned, to his pleasure, that despite all their misfortunes, there was still some money available from the old days. It was not a lot, but it had not been touched in the meantime, and some interest had accumulated. Besides that, they had not been using up all the money that Gregor had been bringing home every month, keeping only a little for himself, so that, too, had been accumulating. Behind the door, Gregor nodded with enthusiasm in his pleasure at this unexpected thrift and caution. He could actually have used this surplus money to reduce his father's debt to his boss, and the day when he could have freed himself from that job would have come much closer. But now it was certainly better the way his father had done things. This money, however, was certainly not enough to enable the family to live off the interest. It was enough to maintain them for perhaps 1 or 2 years, no more. That's to say, it was money that should not really be touched but set aside for emergencies. Money to live on had to be earned. His father was healthy but old and lacking in self-confidence. During the 5 years that he had not been working, the first holiday in a life that had been full of strain and no success, he had put on a lot of weight and become very slow and clumsy. Would Gregor's elderly mother now have to go and earn money? She suffered from asthma, and it was a strain for her to move about the home. Every other day would be spent struggling for breath on the sofa by the open window. Would his sister have to go and earn money? She was still a child of 17. Her life up till then had been very enviable, consisting of wearing nice clothes, sleeping late, helping out at the business, joining in with a few modest pleasures, and most of all, playing the violin. Whenever they began to talk about the need to earn money, Gregor would always first let go of the door and then throw himself onto the cool leather sofa next to it, as he became quite hot with shame and regret. Part 5. In this section, Gregor has escaped captivity in his room, and his mother and sister return to find him crawling up the wall. They had not allowed themselves a long rest and came back quite soon. Greta had pulled her arm around her mother and was nearly carrying her. "What shall we take now, then?" said Greta, and looked around. Her eyes met those of Gregor on the wall. Perhaps only because her mother was there, she remained calm, bent her face so that she would not look around, and said, albeit hurriedly and with a tremor in her voice, "Come on, let's go back to the living room for a while." Gregor could see what Greta had in mind. She wanted to take her mother somewhere safe, and then chasing him down from the wall. Well, she could certainly try it. He sat unyielding on his picture. He would rather jump at Greta's face. But Greta's words had made her mother quite worried. She stepped to one side, saw the enormous brown patch against the flowers of the wallpaper, and before she even realized it was Gregor that she saw, screamed, "Oh God! Oh God!" Arms outstretched, she fell onto the couch as if she had given up everything and stayed there immobile. "Gregor!" shouted his sister, glowering at him and shaking her fist. That was the first word she had spoken to him directly since his transformation. She ran into the other room to fetch some kind of smelling salts to bring her mother out of her faint. Gregor wanted to help too. He could save his picture later, although he stuck fast to the glass and had to pull himself off by force. Then he too ran into the next room as if he could advise his sister like in the old days, but he had to just sit and stand behind her doing nothing. She was looking into various bottles. He startled her when she turned around. A bottle fell to the ground and broke. A splinter cut Gregor's face. Some kind of caustic medicine splashed all over him. Now, without delaying any longer, Greta took hold of all the bottles she could and ran with them to her mother. She slammed the door shut with her foot. So now Gregor was shut out from his mother, who, because of him, might be near to death. He could not open the door if he did not want to chase his sister away, and she had to stay with his mother. There was nothing for him to do but wait. And oppressed with anxiety and self-reproach, he began to crawl about. He crawled over everything, walls, furniture, ceiling, and finally, in his confusion, as the whole room began to spin around him, fell down into the middle of the dinner table. He lay there for a while, numb and immobile. All around him was quiet. Maybe that was a good sign. There was someone at the door. The maid, of course, had locked herself in the kitchen so that Greta would have to go and answer it. His father had arrived home. "What's happened?" were his first words. Greta's appearance must have made everything clear to him. She answered him with a subdued voice and openly pressed her face into his chest. "Mother's fainted, but she's better now. Gregor got out." "Just as I expected," said his father. "Just as I always said. But you women wouldn't listen, would you?" It was clear to Gregor that Greta had not said enough, and that his father took it to mean that something bad had happened, that he was responsible for some act of violence. That meant Gregor would now have to calm his father, as he did not have the time to explain things to him even if that had been possible. So he fled to the door of his room and pressed himself against it so that his father, when he came in from the hall, could see straight away that Gregor had the best intentions and would go back into his room without delay, that it would not be necessary to drive him back, but that they only had to open the door and he would disappear. His father, though, was not in the mood to notice subtleties like that. "Ah!" he shouted as he came in, sounding as if he were both angry and glad at the same time. Gregor drew his head back from the door and lifted it towards his father. He really had not imagined his father the way he stood there now. Of late, with his new habit of crawling about, he had neglected to pay attention to what was going on in the rest of the flat the way he had done before. He really ought to have expected things to have changed. But still, was that really his father? The same tired man as used to be laying there entombed in his bed when Gregor came back from his business trips, who would receive him sitting in the armchair in his nightgown when he came back in the evenings, who was hardly even able to stand up, but as a sign of his pleasure would just raise his arm, and who, on the couple of times a year when they went out for a walk together on a Sunday or in a public holiday, wrapped up tightly in his overcoat between Gregor and his mother, would always labor his way forward a little more slowly than them, who were already walking slowly for his sake, who would place his stick down carefully, and if he wanted to say something would invariably stop and gather his companions around him. He was standing up straight enough now, dressed in a smart blue uniform with gold buttons, the sort worn by employees about the banking institute. Above the high, stiff collar of the coat was strong double chin emerged. Under the bushy eyebrows, his piercing dark eyes looked out fresh and alert. His normally unkempt white hair was combed down painfully close to his scalp. He took his cap, with its gold monogram from probably some bank, and threw it in an arc right across the room onto the sofa, put his hands into his trouser pockets, pushing back the bottom of his long uniform coat, and with a look of determination walked towards Gregor. He probably did not even know himself what he had in mind, but nonetheless lifted his feet unusually high. Gregor was amazed at the enormous size of the soles of his boots, but wasted no time with that. He knew full well right from the first day of his new life that his father thought it necessary to always be extremely strict with him. And so he ran up to his father, stopped when his father stopped, scurried forwards again when he moved, even slightly. In this way, they went around the room several times without anything decisive happening, without even giving the impression of a chase as everything went so slowly. Gregor remained all this time on the floor, largely because he feared his father might see it as an especially provoking if he fled onto the wall or ceiling. Whatever he did, Gregor had to admit that certainly would not be able to keep up this running about for long. As for each step his father took, he had to carry out countless movements. He became noticeably short of breath. Even in his earlier life, his lungs had not been very reliable. Now, as he lurched about in his efforts to muster all the strength he could for running, he could hardly keep his eyes open. His thoughts became too slow for him to think of any other way of saving himself than running. He almost forgot that the walls were there for him to use, although here they were concealed behind carefully carved furniture full of notches and protrusions. Then, right beside him, lightly tossed, something flew down and rolled in front of him. It was an apple. Then another one immediately flew at him. Gregor froze in shock. There was no longer any point in running, as his father had decided to bombard him. He had filled his pockets with fruit from the bowl on the sideboard, and now, without even taking the time for careful aim, threw one apple after another. These little red apples rolled about on the floor, knocking into each other as if they had electric motors. An apple thrown without much force glanced against Gregor's back and slid off without doing any harm. Another one, however, immediately following it, hit squarely and lodged in his back. Gregor wanted to drag himself away as he could remove the surprising, the incredible pain by changing his position, but he felt as if nailed to the spot and spread himself out, all his senses in confusion. The last thing he saw was the door of his room being pulled open. His sister was screaming. His mother ran out in front of her in a blouse, as his sister had taken off some of her clothes after she had fainted to make it easier for her to breathe. She ran to his father, her skirts unfastened and sliding one another to the ground. Stumbling over the skirts, she pushed herself to his father, her arms around him, uniting herself with him totally. Now Gregor lost his ability to see anything, her hands behind his father's head, begging him to spare Gregor's life. Part 6. Father, Mother, said his sister, hitting the table with her hand as an introduction. We cannot carry on like this. Maybe you can't see it, but I can. I don't want to call this monster my brother. All I can say is, we have to try and get rid of it. We've done all that's humanly possible to look after it and be patient. I don't think anyone could accuse us of doing anything wrong. She's absolutely right, said Gregor's father to himself. His mother, who still had not had time to catch her breath, began to cough dully, her hand held out in front of her, and a deranged expression in her eyes. Gregor's sister rushed to his mother and put her head on her forehead. Her words seemed to give Gregor's father some more definite ideas. He sat upright, played with his uniform cap between the plates left by the three gentlemen after their meal, and occasionally looked down at Gregor as he lay there immobile. We have to try and get rid of it, said Gregor's sister, now speaking only to her father, as her mother was too occupied with coughing to listen. It'll be the death of both of you. I can see it coming. We can't all work as hard as we have to and then come home and be tortured like this. We can't endure it. I can't endure it any more. And she broke out so heavily in tears that they flowed down the face of her mother, and she wiped them away with the mechanical hand movements. My child, said her father with sympathy and obvious understanding. What are we to do? His sister just shrugged her shoulders as a sign of the helplessness and tears that had taken hold of her, displacing her earlier certainty. "If he could just understand us," said his father almost as a question. His sister shook her head vigorously through her tears, a sign that there was no question. "If he could just understand us," repeated Gregor's father, closing his eyes in acceptance of his sister's certainty that that was quite impossible, "then perhaps we could come to some kind of agreement with him. But as it is—" "It's got to go," shouted his sister. "That's the only way, Father. You've got to get rid of the idea that that's Gregor. We've only harmed ourselves by believing it for so long. How can that be Gregor? If it were Gregor, he would have seen long ago that it's not possible for human beings to live with an animal like that, and he would have gone off on his own free will. We wouldn't have a brother anymore then, but we could carry on with our lives and remember him with respect. As it is, this animal is persecuting us. It's driven out our tenants. It obviously wants to take over the whole flat and force us to sleep on the streets. Father, look! Just look!" she suddenly screamed. "He's starting again!" In her alarm, which was totally beyond Gregor's comprehension, his sister even abandoned his mother as she pushed herself vigorously out of her chair and more willing to sacrifice her own mother than to stay anywhere near Gregor. She rushed over behind her father, who had become excited merely because she was up and stood up, half raising his hands in front of Gregor's sister, as if to protect her. But Gregor had no intention of frightening anyone, least of all his sister. All he had done was begin to turn around so that he could go back into his room, although that was in itself quite startling, as his pain-racked condition meant that turning around required a great deal of effort, and he was using his head to help himself do it, repeatedly raising it and striking it against the floor. He stopped and looked around. They seemed to have realized his good intention and only been alarmed briefly. Now they all looked at him in unhappy silence. His mother lay in her chair with her legs stretched out and pressed against each other, her eyes nearly closed with exhaustion. His sister sat next to his father with her arms around his neck. "Maybe now they'll let me turn around," thought Gregor, and went back to work. He could not help panting loudly with the effort and had sometimes to stop and take a rest. No one was making him rush anymore. Everything was left up to him. As soon as he had finally finished turning around, he began to move straight ahead. He was amazed at the great distance that separated him from his room, and could not understand how he had covered that distance in his weak state a little while before, and almost without noticing it. He concentrated on crawling as fast as he could, and hardly noticed that there was not a word, not any cry from his family to distract him. He did not turn his head until he had reached the doorway. He did not turn it all the way around as he felt his neck becoming stiff, but it was nonetheless enough to see that nothing behind him had changed. Only his sister had stood up. With his last glance, he saw that his mother had now fallen completely asleep. He was hardly inside his room before the door was hurriedly shut, bolted, and locked. The sudden noise behind Gregor so startled him that his legs collapsed under him. It was his sister who had been in so much of a rush. She had been standing there waiting and sprung forward lightly. Gregor had not heard her come in at all, and as she turned the key in the lock, she said loudly to her parents, "At last!" "What now, then?" Gregor asked himself as he looked around in the darkness. He soon made the discovery that he could no longer move at all. This was no surprise to him. It seemed rather that being able to actually move around on those spindly little legs until then was unnatural. He also felt relatively comfortable. It is true that his entire body was aching, but the pain seemed to be slowly getting weaker and weaker and would finally disappear altogether. He could already hardly feel the decayed apple in his back or the inflamed area around it, which was entirely covered in white dust. He thought back on his family with emotion and love. If it was possible, he felt that he must go away even more strongly than his sister. He remained in this state of empty and peaceful rumination until he heard the clock tower strike 3 in the morning. He watched as it slowly began to get light everywhere outside the window, too. Then, without his willing it, his head sank down completely, and his last breath flowed weakly from his nostrils. Part 7. They decided the best way to make use of that day was for relaxation and to go for a walk. Not only had they earned a break from work, but they were in serious need of it. So they sat at the table and wrote 3 letters of excusal, Mr. Samsa to his employers, Mrs. Samsa to her contractor, and Greta to her principal. The cleaner came in while they were writing to tell them she was going. She finished her work for that morning. The three of them at first just nodded without looking up from what they were writing, and it was only when the cleaner still did not seem to want to leave that they looked up in irritation. "Well?" asked Mr. Samsa. The chairwoman stood in the doorway with a smile on her face as if she had some tremendous good news to report, but would only do it if she was clearly asked to. The almost vertical little ostrich feather on her hat, which had been a source of irritation to Mr. Samsa all the time she had been working for them, swayed gently in all directions. "What is it you want, then?" asked Mrs. Samsa, whom the cleaner had the most respect for. "Yes," she answered, and broke into a friendly laugh that made her unable to speak right away. "Well, then, that thing in there. You needn't worry about how you're going to get rid of it. That's all been sorted out." Mrs. Samsa and Greta bent down over their letters as if the intent on continue with what they were writing. Mr. Samsa saw that the cleaner wanted to start describing everything in detail, but, with an outstretched hand, he made it quite clear that she was not to. So, as she was preventing from telling them all about it, she suddenly remembered what a hurry she was in, and, clearly peeved, called out, "Cheerio then, everyone," turned around sharply, and left, slamming the door terribly as she went. "Tonight she gets sacked," said Mr. Samsa, but he received no reply from either his wife or his daughter as the chairwoman seemed to have destroyed the peace they had only just gained. They got up and went over to the window, where they remained with their arms around each other. Mr. Samsa twisted around in the chair to look at them and sat there watching for a while. He called out, "Come here then. Let's forget about all that old stuff, shall we? Come and give me a bit of attention." The two women immediately did as he said, hurrying over to him where they kissed him and hugged him, and then they quickly finished their letters. After that, the three of them left the flat together, which was something they had not done for months, and took the tram out to the open countryside outside the town. They had the tram, filled with warm sunshine, all to themselves. Leant back and comfortable on their seats, they discussed their prospects and found that on closer examination they were not at all bad. Until then, they had never asked each other about their work, but all three had jobs which were very good, and held particularly good promise for the future. The greatest improvement for the time being, of course, would be achieved quite easily by moving house. What they needed now was a flat that was smaller and cheaper than the current one which had been chosen by Gregor, one that was in better location, and, most of all, more practical. All the time, Greta was becoming livelier. With all the worry they had been having of late, her cheeks had become pale. But while they were talking, Mr. and Mrs. Samsa were struck almost simultaneously with the thought of how their daughter was blossoming into a well-built and beautiful young lady. They became quieter, just from each other's glance, and almost without knowing it, they agreed that it would soon be time to find a good man for her. And, as if in confirmation of their new dreams and good intentions, as soon as they reached their destination, Greta was the first to get up and stretch out her young body.